Have you ever heard that saying, all that glitters is not gold? Well, today we're diving into a story that takes that saying to a whole new level. We're going deep into the world of corporate collapses, big money, and the people who are supposed to protect investors when things go wrong.
Right.
And let me tell you, things get complicated.
What's really interesting here is that we're looking at a situation where the very people entrusted with upholding the system might be the ones exploiting it.
Right.
It's a story that could make anyone think twice about who they trust with their money.
Absolutely. Our deep dive today is based on excerpts from an investigative report called Carrie Ann James and the High Street Group Collapse.
Okay.
Put together by a firm called Insolvency Law, INL for short.
This report raises some serious red flags about Carrie Ann James, the top insolvency practitioner, and her role in the collapse of this company.
To set the stage, High Street Group was in the business of property investment, and they offered these things called loan notes.
Okay.
Which were supposed to be backed by property assets.
Right.
It's pretty straightforward, right?
Except over 1,000 investors lost a total of £126 million when the company went under.
Wow.
Imagine your life savings, your retirement fund, all gone.
Yeah.
That's the reality for a lot of people caught up in this mess.
It's a devastating situation.
It is.
And that's where Carrie Ann James comes in.
Right.
She was appointed by the court to be the administrator for High Street Group when it collapsed. She's a big name in the insolvency world. She even serves as president of the Insolvency Practitioners Association.
Okay.
On paper, she seems like the perfect person to handle this kind of situation.
She's also an officer of the court, which means she's bound by a strict code of ethics.
Yeah.
And has a duty to act in the best interests of the creditors, the people who lost money.
But that's where things get murky.
Oh.
INL claims that instead of helping investors recover their money, James may have actually helped the company's director, Forrest, slip away without facing any real consequences.
That's a pretty serious accusation. It's like finding out the security guard at the bank was actually helping the robbers escape with the loot.
Exactly. So let's unpack what happened during the administration process.
Okay.
The administrator's job is to step in when a company goes bankrupt.
Right.
And try to either rescue the company or, if that's not possible, make sure the creditors get as much of their money back as possible.
Right.
Seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah. But INL argues that James's administration was a complete failure. They claim it achieved absolutely nothing for the investors.
Wow.
And actually delayed the necessary liquidation of the company by a full 3 years.
3 years.
One of INL's consultants, Peter Murray, even said that administration was the wrong approach right from the get-go.
3 years is a long time to wait for answers, especially when you've lost everything.
And it gets worse.
Oh, no.
Despite investors losing £126 million, Carrie Ann James didn't recover a single penny for them.
Hold on.
Not one.
How is that even possible? You'd think with that much money lost, there'd be something to recover.
That's what's so alarming about this case.
Yeah.
INL claims James didn't take any legal action against Gary Forrest, even though it looks like he might have shifted assets out of High Street Group before it went bust.
Okay.
Think of it like this. Imagine you owe someone money, and right before you declare bankruptcy, you transfer all your valuable possessions to a friend.
Oh.
That's essentially what INL is suggesting Forrest might have done.
So he potentially hid his assets while investors were left with nothing.
That's the allegation.
Wow.
And these asset transfers, particularly to a company called Hadrian Real Estate Fall, allegedly happened at prices way below market value.
Okay.
Leaving the investors with absolutely no protection. Remember, those loan notes were supposed to be secured against the property assets.
Right.
Meaning if the company went under, investors could at least get something back by selling those properties.
Yeah.
But if the properties were sold off cheaply or the valuations were inflated to begin with, then the security was basically worthless.
Right, so like buying a theft-proof bike lock, only to find out it's made of plastic.
Exactly.
The protection you thought you had was an illusion.
And INL believes Carrie Ann James, as the administrator, should have seen these red flags.
So they're saying she should have known, like, she should have been able to spot this stuff.
Absolutely.
As an experienced insolvency practitioner, she had a duty to thoroughly investigate High Street Group's finances.
Right.
INL argues that she should have spotted these issues early on.
Yes.
The potentially overvalued properties, the lack of real security for the loan notes.
Right.
And taken action to protect the investors.
Yeah.
So are they saying she deliberately looked the other way?
They don't explicitly say that.
Okay.
But they do raise the question of whether she might have been pressured by Gary Forrest to keep things quiet.
Okay, so we've got these questionable asset transfers.
Right.
No money recovered for investors.
Right.
And a whole lot of unanswered questions.
Yes.
What did INL do to try and get to the bottom of this?
They tried to use a legal tool called a Norwich Pharmacal Order.
Oh, what?
A Norwich Pharmacal Order, or NPO.
Okay.
Which is essentially a court order that forces someone to hand over information.
So INL went to court to try and force Carrie Ann James to reveal what she knew.
Exactly.
Okay.
At first, James agreed to cooperate. But then she demanded a ridiculous amount of money to cover her costs.
Oh, wow.
Essentially making it impossible for INL to get the information.
Sounds like a classic delaying tactic.
It certainly raises that question.
Was she trying to stonewall the investigation?
It's possible.
And there's more.
There is.
INL points out that Carrie Ann James was involved with other companies linked to Gary Forrest.
Oh, really?
Like High Street Residential UK Ltd. And Kent Street HSG Ltd.
And what happened with those companies?
Both were dissolved quickly under her administration with seemingly very little scrutiny.
Interesting.
This suggests a potential pattern of behavior that adds to the concerns about her role in all of this.
Yeah, definitely.
So we've got a potentially compromised administrator, millions of pounds missing,
Right.
and a director who seems to have vanished into thin air.
It's quite a story.
Where does that leave us?
It leaves us with a lot more questions than answers.
Yeah.
And that's why this story is so important. We need to understand how this could happen.
Right.
And what can be done to prevent it from happening again.
Exactly.
But to really understand what might have gone on here, we need to look more closely at the man at the center of it all. Gary Forrest.
All right, so to understand Carrie Ann James's role, we need to understand the person at the center of this whole operation, Gary Forrest.
Right.
Who is he, and what role did he play in all of this?
He was the director of High Street Group and the architect of this whole loan note scheme.
Okay.
He's the one who convinced investors to part with their money, promising them big returns from property investments.
And INL suggests that Carrie Ann James was one of his key enablers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They believe that through her actions or inactions, James allowed Forrest to operate with a level of freedom that ultimately hurt the investors. She oversaw the dissolving of companies, the transfer of assets, all while investors were left wondering where their money went.
So is Forrest some kind of financial mastermind who was able to outsmart Carrie Ann James, or is there a more complicated dynamic at play here?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Was James a willing participant in this scheme, or was she simply in over her head?
Right.
Manipulated by a more experienced operator? The report doesn't give us a definitive answer, but it does point to a close working relationship between the two.
It's starting to feel like one of those financial thrillers you see in the movies.
Yeah.
A web of interconnected companies, suspicious transactions,
Right.
and a cast of characters with potentially conflicting motives.
It's a good reminder that the world of corporate finance can be a very complex
Yeah.
and sometimes very shady place. And it's often difficult to tell who's playing by the rules and who's trying to game the system.
So what does all of this mean? Where do we go from here?
This case highlights the need for greater transparency and accountability in the insolvency process.
Okay.
We need to make sure that the people in charge of these proceedings are actually acting in the best interests of the creditors, the people who lost money,
Right.
not their own interests or the interests of people like Gary Forrest.
We can't just let situations like this happen without consequences.
No, we can't.
There needs to be a thorough investigation to determine exactly what happened and who's responsible for these investors losing their life savings.
Absolutely. And even beyond this particular case, there's a broader lesson here about the importance of due diligence.
Okay.
If you're thinking about investing your money, especially in something that promises big returns, you need to do your homework.
Right.
Research the company,
Yeah.
understand the risks,
Yeah.
and don't be afraid to ask tough questions.
It's like that old saying, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Exactly.
Right.
Don't let the promise of easy money cloud your judgment.
Yeah.
Remember, higher returns usually come with higher risks.
And don't be afraid to walk away from an investment if you have any doubts or if something just doesn't feel right.
Exactly.
It's better to miss out on a potential opportunity than to lose your hard-earned money to a scam.
And remember, there are resources out there to help you.
Oh, okay.
Organizations like INL are dedicated to exposing corporate misconduct and fighting for the rights of investors. Don't hesitate to reach out for help if you have concerns.
It's all about being informed and being proactive.
Right.
Knowledge is your best defense against these kinds of schemes.
It really is.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the specifics of this case.
We have.
But I want to take a step back and look at the bigger picture.
Okay.
What are the implications of this case for the insolvency profession as a whole? I mean, Carrie Ann James was a former president of the Insolvency Practitioners Association.
This case has definitely sent shockwaves through the industry. It's raised serious questions about how effective self-regulation is and whether enough is being done to prevent conflicts of interest.
Being the president of the association, that's a pretty big deal, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a position of authority and influence within the profession.
Right.
And that's why this case is so damaging. It undermines public trust in the entire insolvency process.
Yeah.
And makes people wonder if professional bodies are doing enough to hold their own members accountable.
So what needs to change?
That's a good question.
What kind of safeguards could be put in place to prevent something like this from happening again?
Well, there are a few key areas that need to be addressed.
Okay.
First, we need stronger oversight of insolvency practitioners.
Okay.
This could involve more rigorous background checks, mandatory continuing education, and stricter enforcement of ethical guidelines.
It's about making sure that the people in these positions are not only qualified,
Right.
but also have a proven track record of ethical behavior.
Exactly. We also need greater transparency in the insolvency process itself.
Okay.
That means making information about asset valuations, transactions, and creditor distributions more readily available.
So investors can actually see what's happening with their money
Yes.
and hold the insolvency practitioners accountable.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And finally, we need to create a culture of accountability within the profession.
Okay.
That means encouraging insolvency practitioners to report any misconduct they see.
Right.
And making sure that wrongdoing is dealt with swiftly and decisively.
It's about sending a clear message that unethical behavior won't be tolerated.
Right.
This case has really exposed some serious flaws in the system.
It has.
Hopefully, it will serve as a wake-up call for the insolvency profession to make some real changes and regain the public's trust.
I agree.
Yeah.
The stakes are simply too high to let this kind of misconduct continue unchecked.
Yeah.
We need to learn from this experience and take steps to protect investors and make sure the insolvency process is fair and transparent for everyone involved.
This has been a truly eye-opening deep dive.
It has.
We've uncovered a complex web of corporate intrigue, potential misconduct, and a devastating loss for ordinary investors.
It's a reminder that we can't take anything at face value.
Yeah.
We need to be critical thinkers, ask tough questions, and demand accountability from those in positions of power.
Before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about the importance of due diligence.
Sure.
For our listeners out there, what are some key things they should look for when considering an investment opportunity?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
First and foremost, be wary of any investment that promises unusually high returns with little or no risk.
Right.
Remember, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Don't let greed or the desire for a quick buck cloud your judgment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Always remember that higher returns usually come with higher risks.
And don't be afraid to walk away from an investment if you have any doubts or if something just doesn't feel right.
That's right.
It's better to miss out on a potentially profitable opportunity than to lose your hard-earned money in a scam.
That's right.
Trust your instincts. And don't let anyone pressure you into making a decision you're not comfortable with.
And remember, there's no such thing as a stupid question when it comes to investing your money.
Okay.
If something isn't clear, ask for clarification.
Right.
If you're not comfortable with the answer, walk away.
So after this deep dive into the High Street Group collapse, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
I think the biggest one is that even in industries that seem well-regulated, things can go wrong.
Yeah.
And often it's the most vulnerable people who end up paying the price.
It's easy to assume that someone with Carrie Ann James's credentials and position would be acting with integrity.
Right.
But this case shows that we can't just take things at face value.
Right.
We need to be informed, ask questions,
Yes.
and hold those in power accountable.
And often it's the most vulnerable people who end up paying the price.
It's easy to assume that someone with Carrie Ann James's credentials and position would be acting with integrity.
Right.
But this case shows that we can't just take things at face value.
Right.
We need to be informed, ask questions, and hold those in power accountable.
Exactly.
It's a stark reminder that we can't simply trust people based on their titles or positions.
Yeah.
Whether it's an insolvency practitioner, a financial advisor, or anyone else handling your money due diligence is absolutely crucial.
Exactly. And it's not just about protecting ourselves.
Right.
By understanding these situations and recognizing the red flags, we can also help protect others who might be more vulnerable to these types of schemes.
That's a really important point. Knowledge is power.
Yes.
And by sharing what we've learned today, we can help empower others to make more informed decisions and avoid becoming victims of financial misconduct.
Absolutely. Think of it like this. If you learned that a certain type of car had a faulty braking system, wouldn't you want to warn your friends and family?
Of course.
It's the same principle here. The more people who understand how these schemes work and what to look out for, the harder it will be for those who try to take advantage of others.
This deep dive has definitely uncovered more questions than answers, and that's precisely why it matters.
Yeah.
We can't afford to let stories like this slip through the cracks.
Right.
We need to shine a light on these practices and demand better protections for investors.
I agree. This case underscores the crucial need for transparency and accountability in corporate governance.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder that even individuals in positions of authority can be involved in questionable dealings.
Right.
As informed citizens, we must remain vigilant, ask tough questions, and demand answers.
So to wrap things up, here's a final thought-provoking question for our listeners. What safeguards could be put in place to better protect investors from situations like the High Street Group collapse?
Mm-hmm.
What systemic changes could prevent something like this from happening again?
That's the question we all need to be asking.
Yeah.
It's a complex issue with no easy solutions. But it's a conversation we need to have.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it's about creating a fairer, more transparent financial system that works for everyone, not just a select few.
This has been a truly insightful deep dive into a complex and troubling case.
It has.
We've learned about the potential pitfalls of corporate structures, the importance of due diligence,
Right.
and the need for greater transparency and accountability in the financial world.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in protecting ourselves and each other from financial misconduct.
Yeah.
By staying informed, asking critical questions,
Right.
and demanding better from those in positions of power,
Right.
we can help create a more just and equitable financial system for everyone.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thank you.
We'll be back next time with another fascinating exploration of a topic that matters to you.
See you then.
Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay vigilant.